Welcome everyone to the location data in Drupal 8 session.
Hey Bob.
Hey. Okay.
If you're not here for location data in Drupal 8, you're in the wrong place.
He's socially awkward. Okay.
I could not tell at all. If we weren't socially awkward, we wouldn't be here.
Right. So we're going to talk a little bit about background and requirements of a project we did with the Chicago Park District. This presentation is really going to be a case study, just so we can show some practical examples. We're going to talk about modules we used, core, contributed, and custom modules. Then we're going to talk about importing data from different kinds of sources, processing the data and formatting it for display, and the displays we used, and then making the location data available for other places to consume. And then problems and questions we will handle at the end.
So I guess I'm first up.
Yeah.
My name's Matthew Messmer. I'm the Director of International Business at Genero in Tokyo, Japan. That's a fancy way to say that I'm like the lead Drupal developer over there. We partnered with Bob's company, Clarity, on this project with Chicago Parks District.
Yes, and I am Robert Schell. Most people call me Bob. Unless I'm in Kentucky, my cousins call me Bobby. I've been Drupaling for over 9 years. Started out just as a kind of a thing to use that I didn't really understand, and into a hobby, and now it's what I do. So this project that we got into this location data with is the Chicago Park District's new website. They have 600 parks in the system, but over 2,000 facility locations within it. Every statue, fountain, field house is a location. So we had a lot of data. Photos, hours, everything pertinent to a location. The park district's pretty huge. It's the whole city, 26 miles, 23 swimming beaches, just so much stuff. And they have events and programs for every season. And there are thousands of those as well, and they all take place at locations. So it's not just this location data is going to be on a map somewhere on a page. It's used by things like programs and events. If you wanted to check any of this out, chicagoparkdistrict.com. They have lots of page views, and the popular content all includes location data. Programs have locations, the parks themselves, and the events, and even schedules like for pool schedules when you can register for swimming. They're all at a pool. So it's highly location based. The requirements we had were to import data from multiple sources because the program data source was an unsupported SOAP service. It's kind of like at end of life, and it might not have even ever been something that was for the general public. So we kind of had this data we had to work with that we couldn't call up and say, hey, can you change this for us? We had to wrangle it. We also had to add supplemental information like the hours and descriptions and photos from the old website, and we used the CSV files that were exported from the old website's database to match up with the basic park data that we had and append it. We also had to do daily updates for those programs and events, and we kind of turned Migrate into a daily import of those new programs and events that still had to match up with the location data. Then, after we had all that into Drupal, we had to display lists of parks and facilities so people could find the ones that are by name or closest to them. Then the maps for those lists, either side by side or just maps on the park themselves with all the facilities within the park. And then, of course, on the detail pages, yeah. Third requirement was they have a mobile app for events. called My Shy Parks, and you can check in at parks for points and find events at the parks with that app. So we had to supply feeds for that app to consume. So we had to do a lot with this location data, and it was very challenging, fun, and interesting.
Mm-hmm. And we might want to mention that for various reasons, the app, the phone app, was unable to be updated to match any changes in the RESTful API. So the RESTful API that we had to create for the new Drupal 8 site needed to match exactly, like character for character, the formatting of the old API.
So we had constraints on both ends.
Mm-hmm.
So modules that we used and turned into our own: geolocation and Geocoder, Migrate Tools and Migrate Plus for our crazy imports, and then Ultimate Cron to do those daily imports. Of course, they used the core modules Migrate and RESTful Web Services, and we made quite a bit of number of custom modules. One main one for the imports, but then some sub-modules, so we could run a cron for each. And then custom blocks for map displays. We had a couple of different map displays that were required. Custom field formatters were in a module as well, and the feeds. So importing data, we have dynamic and static data. Then processing is the next step for turning that data into the proper, or getting it mapped into Drupal. Formatting, make sure that it's able to be put into that field, because it gets kind of picky. So dynamic sources, for this project, the SOAP service, the REST services, JSON feeds, any other service, dynamic service. Static service, documents usually, anything that you import from a file. So dynamic sources, you often have little or no control over the data that you're receiving, like we were talking about. Sometimes you can get it changed to your needs, but it's not often. The Drupal Migrate module usually assumes that you're mapping one-to-one fields, but you might need to combine 5 fields from a source into one address field, or the other way around. So also dynamic sources, sometimes they go down. You may have authentication problems at times depending on your account status, so you have to make sure that you're paying attention and everything is always up. Data is always current though, if you have a dynamic source, and the processes are automated, so that's awesome, but the challenges are getting the correct data and getting it properly formatted. So this, do you want to talk a little about this?
Yeah. This is an example of the Migrate source plugin that we wrote for the SOAP call. So in the Migrate module provides a number of source plugins, a lot surrounding like database calls to old Drupal websites, or like importing like CSV files. But for our purpose, we needed to extend one of the source plugins to make it work for the Chicago Parks District SOAP service that we were needing to use. So this makes a call to the SOAP service and retrieves the results that we're later able to parse through to add the data into Drupal.
And Mark Delayed back there was very instrumental in helping us get this going. So
thanks a lot.
Just wanted to give him the proper credit there. So static sources are good because you have complete control over your data. You can pre-format all your addresses and taxonomies and everything to what the Drupal fields need, and they're all one-to-one if you desire. They can handle large imports because you're not using a over-the-internet connection or just having to take some time out. Challenge of that is you might have to do an export from your vendor every time you do a different iteration of your dev site, or like a couple hours before going live to get that data to be current.
So in my experience, I've found that having the static sources like a CSV file or an Excel spreadsheet that you're importing data from, this is really good for like a one-time import where you're like migrating a site and you just need to get the old data in once and you're not going to run it again. Whereas if you go to the trouble of setting up the SOAP call or importing a JSON feed, that's really great if you need to run that on like a daily basis to keep getting the new information.
And that's a big file.
Yeah, so this is an example of just like a CSV or Excel spreadsheet where you just got all your data in there. You've got like a key value on the left, and you got your like address, city, state, and then this just gets parsed and can be added into Drupal.
And the key value is a little weird, but that's because a lot of the park names, that's actually the park name column, they had weird characters and apostrophes and things that databases don't like. So we actually at one point just substituted the park names with their ID from the service and proceeded by the amount of times that we tried to import it in letters. All right, so processing. The Migrate module has many different methods available for processing your incoming data. You can use date formatters. There are callbacks for any PHP function. Makes it very handy. There's not much documentation on that though, so it takes a lot of reading and a lot of guessing to get it to work. But then once you get the hang of it, it is pretty awesome. You can map your fields to one or many, map your data to one or many fields, like in that address as an example where you might have street address, zip code, a bunch of different fields that need to go into one address field. And you can look up data that you're importing by using the migrate map table from another import. If you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So just as a little bit of background here too, like the Migrate module, your migrations are sort of split into two stages. You have the source where you get the data, and then you process the data. So no matter what method you've used to get the source data, whether it's from a CSV file or from a SOAP call or a XML document, once you've gotten that data split into different rows, then you process the data and add it into Drupal. So when it does that, you've got a key value for identifying, like a unique identifier for that object. And this isn't the Drupal NID or TID of the content you're creating, but it can be like a legacy ID or like whatever you specify in your source plugin. And once you have this set up, the Migrate module takes care of creating a map table of the source ID to the newly created Drupal ID, whether it's the NID or the TID or whatever it is of the content you're creating. So this is very nice because the Migrate module automatically keeps track for you of all the content that you've already imported. You don't have to worry about importing something twice or getting duplicates because it's already taking care of that for you. And it stores it in a table, so you're able to do a lookup through a SQL query later on, where maybe in another process or another part of the website, you know the original ID of the content and you want to get the new Drupal ID. You can perform a quick lookup on that and get that really easily.
As an example, we had to do that with category taxonomy terms. In the old system, it had the old system ID, and in Drupal, it has its term ID. So we had to match data just on the string of text for that term. So we didn't have keys. We just could match it by doing a database query for that, and then properly get it processed. Also with taxonomy terms, we had a lot of terms due to some disorganization in the previous system that were like, had a hyphen in the middle. They had a kind of like a parent term before the dash, and then the actual term afterward. And we were able to split that up into actually using the first term before the dash to associate with the parent term, and then use the one after the dash as a child term.
Yeah, so in some of the SOAP calls, the parent and child terms would be returned in separate fields, but in other SOAP calls, they would just be returned in one field with the two term names separated by a dash. They weren't even using the actual ID value. So we had to do a lot of juggling with the data to split that up and look up the term IDs based on the name instead of the old system's unique identifier. So all this kind of stuff can be done, but it requires coding some like custom plugins for the migration module so that you can get it all set up. So this is an example of a YAML file. This is the configuration file for a migration. You specify all the fields that you want to import from the old system, and you match them up with the Drupal field names. So the fields in the old system are what you see on the left. Can you point to that, Bob, under fields? Yeah, this part here. And then they're matched up with Drupal field names on the right. And in some of these circumstances, it's just a simple one-to-one, like data from the SOAP call directly into a Drupal field. But other times, like you'll see for field Chicago community, we have to run this through another migration where the community terms are being created by a different migration and get the updated Drupal term IDs, because the SOAP call that we're calling in this migration isn't returning, of course, the Drupal term IDs. It returns the old system's term IDs, which then, when the Chicago community terms were created by the other migration, it stores the association of the original ID to the Drupal ID in the migrate map table. Any other insights here?
No.
Okay. So, formatting.
Yeah. We're going to kind of relate this to our modules here. Address field module, I guess I didn't put that in the module list, but it's a basic but crucial field. It stores the basic location data, and that's where each one of those pieces of the address lives that we can use to get coordinates and get things ready to be on a map. The Geocoder module calculates coordinates based on those address fields via service, like Google Maps or any other of those geocoding services.
It's got like 10 different services you can specify.
And then the geolocation module stores the coordinates in the database and allows you to actually select a place on a map. There's a map selection part of the field, and that's helpful, especially for our example of the Chicago Park District. Their statues are in the middle of a field sometimes. There's not an address, and we don't want it to use the closest address because it might, like Lincoln Park's 8 miles long, and if the address is in the middle, it's not going to work. So you can just click on the map and set the coordinates there, and we are in the right place. We also, you want to talk about the trait, the custom traits?
Oh, so we created a custom module that supplied a trait to our different classes that gave some sort of helper methods for calculating the distance between 2 points, like two geocoordinate points, or looking up taxonomy term parents based on the child terms, and things like that.
We also had a polyline field that needed to store the boundaries of a park for the app, so when people checked in to the park, the app knows that if they're in the park or not, actually, so they deny their points if they're sitting at home.
Yes.
Question, Bob?
quick. I'm sorry, I missed the geolocation thing. You're talking about moving the pins around. So every time you do an import, you have to like go through all the nodes and move the pins around?
No, it's saved.
It's saved?
On import, if the park has an address, the Geocoder module gets called automatically and generates GPS coordinates for the address that is given. But I think it's the next slide where we show when you're adding a node manually in Drupal, there's an interface for both looking up the geocoordinates based on the address or clicking on the map to set the pin manually.
The challenge of all of this coordinate generation is that the amount of data that we had for this project and any large project would require paid geocoding because there's a lot and we have to do it quite often. So we used the Google API and a paid account, and it's still, we're doing some heavy dev work. During that time, we would reach our limit for the day.
We'd hit our API call limit. And you hit the free API call limit pretty quickly if you're dealing with a large amount of data.
Yeah, when we were doing our initial imports, it did that a lot, yes.
Oh, you guys can talk more about that later? Mm-hmm. Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah.
If we don't answer your question by the end, please let us know.
Yeah.
Geolocation support polygons as well, and getting centroids and stuff like that? Or is it just Latin long?
It's just Latin long, and then it also calculates some like sine and cosine things that I don't quite understand that it uses to more quickly do distance-based lookups. Because it like pre-calculates some stuff. But the polyline thing with the area part of it, that's something where we had to store it in a text field, and that was data that we imported from an external system.
In theory, you could handle that in a custom function.
So I had to save my polygon as a giant string.
Right. The geolocation field doesn't support that.
Next one.
Yeah, so this is the node edit form where we have the address field up at the top, and then the map below that is the widget provided by the geolocation field. And then in the background, the Geocoder module forms like a link between the two fields, so that when you type in an address in the address field and you click locate address on the map, the Geocoder module calls out to Google or whatever other service you've specified to get the GPS coordinates of the address, and then enters those GPS coordinates into the geolocation field.
Is that out of the box, or did you guys have to custom?
That's all out of the box. In addition to this, you can put a pin onto the map manually by clicking it, and that will store those GPS coordinates into the geolocation field. And you can do this one of like two different ways. You could manually enter an address and put the pin somewhere else that's unrelated to the address. If, like, for example, the park has a official address, but you want the pin to be in the middle of the park instead of the like roadside location that the address would be indicating. You can also click to put a pin, and then on the right there's the push to address button that will perform a reverse lookup where, based on the GPS coordinates, it tries to find, the Geocoder module will try to find the closest like street address to that pin. This can work. This is a little bit unreliable, because if you like click in the middle of a big park and you try and push to address, it's a little dicey on where it actually finds the address. So in those circumstances, I think it was better usually to manually type, but that wasn't always possible. And then you can see at the bottom, this is an output from the database of the field provided by the geolocation module. And you can see that the geolocation module is just storing the like GPS coordinates in it. And then these coordinates we'll be using later on to show the data in many different ways.
Question. with a projection type? Can you specify that? Or
I don't believe so. It just stores it as latitude and longitude. So
There are a lot of options with the module, but we didn't really explore all of them since we didn't have the need. But play around with it; it's cool. So for the daily imports that were required, we used submodules for each import so they could have their own cron job. And we were able to do many different cron jobs because of Ultimate Cron Module, which allows you to do a lot of settings for your jobs. You can run them at different times. You can set them at any interval that you can set with the regular Drupal cron. So what we did was copy the update hook from Migrate Tools for each one, so we could run that separately for each import. And we were also able to add custom error output for each import as well, so we knew what was breaking and why.
okay.
Yeah. And then I also, go to the next slide. Just for, here's the structure of the submodule, the module file where we put the hook in, and I also like to save the YAML config file for the import in a module just as a backup, because sometimes your config directory, your sync directory can get accidentally messed up, and it's good to have like a master settings to go back to.
So this is the cron hook that's run to kick off the migration on a daily basis, and it runs the Drupal migration that we specified a few slides ago. And one of the important things here is where it says migration get ID map prepare update. This is what allows the migration to be run in update mode. So instead of just creating new nodes, which is the default, it will update any existing nodes with any data that has changed in the SOAP call. So as I was saying before, the migration module keeps that map table that automatically tracks the legacy ID with the new Drupal ID, and it uses that to make sure that instead of creating duplicate content in Drupal, it updates the existing content.
Okay, so now we're on to display. Like I mentioned before, we had a need for lists, maps, and detail pages, so we're going to go through those.
Mm-hmm. This is displaying the location data in different ways.
So for lists, we use view modes. So we were able to create sidebar lists for map pages and put all those format and theme those chunks easily. That made a custom field formatter for the distance from user. If you want to say anything about that.
Well, I'll talk about that in
Okay,
the slide where
cool.
it shows it.
And we also had to pull in other location info or content related to lists, like schedules.
So here's like a pretty simple display of the location, the park's content in a list. And in this case, we're displaying the address and the GPS coordinates, but we're not displaying the GPS coordinates just as GPS, as the numbers, because that wouldn't make any sense to people. So there's a custom field formatter that I created that takes the GPS coordinates stored by the Geolocation Module and performs a lookup to comparing the location of the park to the user's location provided by the browser, and calculates how many miles away the user is from the park.
Did you possibly share that back with the community, or is that?
No, that's some. It's. I think I put it up on my GitHub to share out, but I haven't pushed it to. I haven't created a patch or anything for the geolocation module.
If you didn't have GPS location data from the browser, is that just hidden then?
It wouldn't show anything. So the way that it works is the field formatter creates an empty, I think it's a div tag, or it's either a div tag or like a span tag, and there's data attributes on that tag that are the Latin long values, and then there's a JavaScript file that gets loaded after page load, and it performs the lookup and then changes the value inside the div or the span tag to show this markup with the distance from the user. So if it didn't have anything, it would just be an empty HTML tag that wasn't displaying anything.
And we have the maps. We also used view modes for the tooltips, so we could get the kind of the same but modified information on hover or click. For the markers themselves, we showed a standard marker for most maps, but the event map needed custom markers for holidays and different event types. So we did a little magic using taxonomy values and image fields stored within the taxonomy to make that happen. We also had to organize facilities to their parks. In that map, we had to create the field house, the main location of all of those, on the top of the stack, so you weren't seeing the statue first. You probably wanted to go to the main part.
So here's an example of one of the maps where we're showing the GPS coordinates by showing the markers, by loading the markers onto the map for each location. And as Bob said, that the field house would always need to be on top. Is in the data that we were getting from the Parks District, often the individual facilities in the park, like if the park had a swimming pool or a statue or whatever it was, playground, the GPS coordinates that we were getting from their service were not really unique to that individual facility. They were all just sort of stacked on top of each other. So one of the requirements was that we have the field house on top. So I had to do some fancy sorting in the SQL query to make sure that that result was always returned on top.
And for a park detail page, we had to show all those child locations from the main park in that map that we just looked at. Also, narrow the child locations when you type in the search box in that map, and it kind of filters kind of as you're typing the location type, so it's kind of neat. Then, because the map's in a custom block, you're able to put it in any position on any page, and it makes it really easy to use.
So here's one of the park detail pages for Messmer Park, and here we're displaying the address field and some of the other fields from the node in the park description. So feeds. So the last part of this for displaying the park data was to create a feed, like I said, and this was consumed by the Chicago Parks District phone app. And as I mentioned before, we had to match the output of the feed from the original website, like character for character, because they were unable to do any updates to the app. It had to just work seamlessly when the new site was launched. So Drupal 8 provides a really easy way to create these RESTful APIs using the views module, but you don't have total control over the output. And since we needed the output to be very specific, we had to create our own REST resource extending the Drupal core RESTful web services module. And this was actually pretty easy, but you have to write some code instead of just using views. Anything you want to add? Okay. So this is an example of the code we use to create the endpoint in a module. So it's very simple. Unlike most things in Drupal 8 where you have to have a bunch of YAML files to specify what you're doing, in this case all you have to do is have this resource plugin in the correct folder, And up in the comment block here, you specify that it's a REST resource, and you give it the URI path, and then it just works. And you extend the resource-based class provided by the RESTful Web Services module, and you can have a bunch of code that loads up all your data, and you return a Symfony response object, and you have a REST feed. It's pretty easy. Looks easy, right? So here's where we're able to, like, because it's just the PHP code, we have complete control over how we want all the data processed and displayed in the feed, which is, as I said, the reason we weren't able to use views, because views didn't provide the like really, really finite control that we needed.
So problems encountered. We talked about some of them, but specifically the migration, sometimes we would have a field come in that was empty from the API, and maybe the first time we wrote the processing plugin, we didn't skip
Didn't
on
check
empty.
for that.
Yeah, so there's a function, there's a callback you can use in the YAML file that's called skip on empty to do that before it gets to the plugin, or in the plugin you can do any is empty or.
And if you don't do this, then it like crashes,
Yeah.
and you get a lot of failures in your migration.
Same with formatting. Not directly related to location data, but date fields are huge with this. Sometimes the date format will come over different than you expected than all the other dates previously, and it'll break. So you need to handle that as well in a plugin. Another thing you can encounter in migration, especially with these daily imports, are server or API timeouts. If you're trying to get 15,000 records to see if there are any changes on them, and your server's not at the largest capacity, it can give you a timeout. So you might have to whittle down the service call to a more specific set of records that you're trying to get data from. Geocoding problems. Like I mentioned before, the paid API key for the volume, it was a must, or else we weren't going to get anywhere for all these markers. I think, no, that's probably not all of them either.
That's not all.
Yeah. Also, in development, the geocoding didn't work over HTTP.
This is the user's location from the browser. If they access the page over HTTP instead of HTTPS, the browser, or most modern browsers, will deny the location request.
So you just have to make sure to make a self-signed certificate for your machine
When
you want to test
developing
that
locally, yeah.
And mention the inconsistencies.
Yeah, so like, I think in Google Chrome, if you're presented with the pop-up to share your location with the website, you click it once and then it remembers it by default. Whereas in Firefox, the default behavior is just to allow the request once, and then each time the page is reloaded, they'll get asked again unless they check the little tiny box that nobody, when testing, checks that says remember this decision. And then there's also inconsistencies in the like fail state of these requests. Different browsers would give different responses when the user denies the request, so it was kind of hard to give useful messages to the user, whether the API, whether the like location request timed out, or whether they denied it, or whether they just never clicked anything at all.
All right, question time. Yes.
First one, did you guys look at any other geocoding services besides Google, and sort of what was the pros and cons of other ones, and why go with Google in the end?
The question was, did we look at any other services than Google for geocoding? And we did not. We just figured that was the standard for what we needed, and we already had an API key actually from a different project, so that was really the biggest decision driver there, but yeah, I haven't tested any other ones. Yes?
On the node edit page, you had address field and location coordinate fields, and they're related somehow. So how are they connected, and what if you have like multiple of one or the other on the same node, if that's even possible?
So the question was how the address field and the geolocation field are connected, and what happens if you have multiple ones. And they're connected with the Geocoder module. That's the module that forms the bridge between the two of them. And as I recall, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think that in the configuration for the geolocation field, you have to specify one source field. So you have one address field. So I think if you had multiple potential values, you would need multiple fields.
Yes?
You wrote your own polyline, basically. Used your own text field as a polyline. Is there a reason you didn't use the map object field or something like that?
The question was, we stored polyline in a text field instead of creating our own, and the answer is because it was already made.
But there's also a map polyline module out there. Did you look at that?
We didn't.
Map object?
Yeah, we just needed to pass it through to the app, so we didn't need to do any modification or updates to it. That's why.
So you're not showing the polylines in your site?
No, not in the site at all. Just for the
It's
app.
just there to be in the feed, in the RESTful service that the phone app consumes.
I don't know how much you guys can speak to this, but the actual adoption of what you guys built in the wild, are most people using the mobile app? Are people actually using the website on the mobile phone?
The question is, are users using the website more or the app? And as we believe, the app is not used as much as the website.
The app's really pretty limited.
Yes, Kelly knows about this.
Yeah. It's pretty limited. It's just like interested in very specific categories of events. So it's not as rich as the website functionality.
And on Android, at least it was 100,000 downloads, so. But by the way, did you know there's a fake GPS or several fake GPS apps so you can check in from a location even?
I
if
did
you're
not.
there? I use that on
You got lots of
Facebook
park
app
points?
to check into new over in the UK to by a friend of mine.
Yes?
How much control over the map display you have in this? Like, can you actually modify your map, your base map, change, like you can overlay different things on it, or create different endpoints?
So the question is how much control we have over the display of the map. And when using the Google Maps, you do have some options to use things like overlays or change the colors or things like that. You can specify whether it's showing like the satellite by default, whether it shows like the road map view by default, whether those buttons are there to switch between the different view modes, things like that.
Yes?
Just kind of related to that, I saw the page with the map and the pins on it. Like, what's actually delivering that to the user?
So the question was what's displaying the map to the user, and in most cases it's a custom block that we created that is calling to the functionality provided by the geolocation module. It's the same thing that if you created a view and used the geolocation module's display formatter, it would create the map for you. So we're just doing that, but we're using it in a custom module. So it's provided by the geolocation module.
How do you determine the location of the user?
So the question is, how do we determine the location of the user? And this is functionality that's built into the browser, and we use JavaScript to call to the browser to request the user's location.
And what's it based on? Your internet hosting company? Or?
It's I think it depends on whether they're on a like a PC or a mobile phone. I believe if they're on a mobile phone, it uses the location data from the phone. If they're on the PC. I think it uses the IP address as lookup.
Which the phone can actually be the GPS chip, but they also use Wi-Fi data around you because Google knows where the Wi-Fi hotspots are. So if it sees you within range of different hotspots, there's a question it constantly asks you if you want to use finer data, and that's what it is. Is it looks to see what hotspots.
Yeah, like for our purposes, that wasn't. We didn't really need to concern ourselves with how we got that data. We just needed to use
it's on a PC, it's not that accurate if it's based upon the IP.
It seems like if you go to Google Maps and you look at the map, it'll still like show the little blue dot to indicate where you are. And in my experience, it's kind of creepily accurate. it'll show me like inside my house in Tokyo.
On the area of the country you're in.
Okay.
Being in Michigan, it's wildly inaccurate, especially with a lot of the newer ISPs.
Well, in Tokyo, it's really accurate. It showed me inside my house.
How do you have the child locations set up? Is that a different content type? And how do you geocode for places that don't have an address?
All locations are location type. And
there's an entity reference to the parent location.
And how we determined after import what was what is locations that had a parent location were not parks. They were facilities. So then we generated a location or entity type park or facility off of that so we could tell them apart. And the way that we geocoded things that didn't have an address were through the Geocoder module from the map where you click on it. Yes?
So with Geolocation Module, I'm not familiar with it. Can you swap in, say, leaflet instead of Google Maps?
And so the question is, which other map providers besides Google can you use with the Geolocation Module? And it provides a lot, including Leaflet. There were like OpenStreetMaps, Leaflet, Bing, like 5 or 6 others that I'd never even heard of. And I looked at the module's code, and it looks like it'd be pretty easy to provide your own custom one by just sort of copying the code that the module used to create one of those and then modifying it to work with whatever new service you needed to use it with.
Sort of similar to the previous question, which was how did you find related or child locations? So that was all through taxonomy. There wasn't anything that was, this location is within a certain number of miles from this location.
The question is, were there other ways that we determined parent and child locations based on proximity? No, the data that we were getting was very, very highly curated, so we couldn't guess at anything or provide suggestions. We wanted everything a certain way and provide us with that data. So.
But there are filter plugins in views and filters that you can use in SQL queries that would give you locations by proximity. I've done that on other projects.
Yes.
Back in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about migration and process plugins and figuring out migrate process plugins. Do you have any suggestions on ways to improve or go about the learning process without digging through lots and lots of YAML files?
So the question was, any suggestions on how to become an expert at migrations? And I've done quite a few now, and I'm still finding new stuff. Like we mentioned, the documentation isn't really complete. There's a lot of powerful stuff that the migration module can do that isn't really documented. I just found a lot of stuff by Google searches and looking through the example code that the modules provide, because it provides some example migrations.
Has a simple and an advanced example. A simple example is taxonomy terms. The advanced example is nodes about beer, which is kind of weird, and you can't really uninstall it easily. So you might have on your project nodes about beer for a little bit until you can get your config straight and get them out of there.
Yeah, when you run migrate status, you'll still see the beer node migration sometimes.
I found that the example, the advanced example, is also incomplete. Parts of it are not finished or documented. And the best from a starting point to get started with Migrate, the only comprehensive guide I've seen is the guide on Drupal is Me, which of course is behind paywall.
There was a session yesterday about it.
And there's been a number of sessions at various camps and DrupalCons, so you might be able to find some good information on YouTube, but most of what I've learned from reading people's blog posts and then experience.
Any other questions? Okay, one thing I did not mention at the beginning, I work for Clarity Partners. We do mostly government work, public sector stuff. So this Park District project was an extension of that, and yeah, a little bit about the company that did this.
So if you have a government website that you need built, go see Clarity Partners.
Yes.
And if you need...
Or non-public sector. Take all.
Thank you.